It is Graham here, living the dream in 2020, and to get from our home here in sunny Straven to the gorgeous Sandals Grand St Lucia requires us to take two flights. The first of all from our home airport here in Glasgow in west central Scotland down to London Gatwick, and then the next day from London Gatwick across to St Lucia's Hewanorra International Airport. This video is a pure trip report, and it's a trip report aboard British Airways from London Gatwick to St Lucia in the Club World cabin, and it is a trip Fiona and I have made many times and vlogged them here on YouTube. However, it is October 2020, we are in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic, and I've got no idea what it is like to travel aboard British Airways during these strange times. So let's see what happens when Fiona and I travel aboard British Airways in the Club World cabin from London Gatwick to St Lucia's Hewanorra Airport during October 2020. You join Fiona and I first thing on Tuesday morning as we leave the Premier Inn Gatwick North Terminal, heading for the short walk to the North Terminal itself to check in for our British Airways flight across to St Lucia. We stayed at the Premier Inn last night after arriving in London Gatwick from Glasgow on board an EasyJet, and of course you can follow us on this flight via our trip report on board that very EasyJet from Glasgow down to London Gatwick. Just go back to video number 154, where you can also get the 30-second tour of our very basic but very practical and also very comfortable room at the Premier Inn Gatwick North Terminal. And if you go back to our last video, number 155, you can follow Fiona and I as we make a day trip into London as we kill that day between the flight down to London Gatwick from Glasgow and our flight this morning to St Lucia. Anyway, back to Tuesday morning and the 5-minute walk from the Premier Inn over to the North Terminal itself, where we'll be checking in for our British Airways flight over to St Lucia. And some of you may be asking, British Airways check in at the South Terminal. They've been doing that for the last 3 years. Not in October 2020, guys, because during the coronavirus, the Gatwick Airport authorities have closed the South Terminal completely, so all departures and arrivals are taking place at the North Terminal currently. And of course, the reason I say currently is because these things tend to change. If there's anything we've learned from this coronavirus pandemic, decisions around travel seem to change on a daily basis. So as we exit the lift, or what the Americans call the elevator, it's deja vu for Fiona and I, because we used to use the North Terminal all the time on our journeys out to the Caribbean, because British Airways operated from the North Terminal for well over a decade, ending only 3 years ago, when they moved to the South Terminal, allowing for EasyJet to pretty well take over the entire North Terminal themselves, and of course Virgin Atlantic, who've sadly pulled out of Gatwick in the last few months. Again, another victim to Lady Corona. As you could see from our trip report yesterday, and of course our day trip into London, things are certainly not normal in October 2020. The North Terminal was absolutely dead. In fact, the North Terminal at this time of year would typically see about 4,000 passengers an hour passing through the duty-free mall and into the departure lounge. But what we were told today is that Gatwick Airport's North Terminal would only see about 4,000 passengers for the entire day. And as Fiona and I check in at the dedicated British Airways Club World, or their business class line, I should remind you that we had to provide a negative PCR COVID test prior to making this journey, and this paperwork was checked by the BA check-in agent before issuing our boarding passes. And if you go back to video number 147, you can follow the process that Fiona and I went through to get these PCR tests done in time to travel to St Lucia. Back to Tuesday morning as Fiona and I are approaching the security screening facility at Gatwick's North Terminal. I promise, guys, that will be the last plug for a previous video. So from now on and throughout the St Lucia 2020 series, I propose to produce and release my videos every Thursday and Monday morning. So if you want to follow Fiona and I as we enjoy nearly 2 weeks at the Sandals Grand St Lucia in October 2020, you know what to do, guys. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Fiona's birthday had been 4 days earlier, and one of the presents I gave her was a very cheap IOU. And yes, guys, I delivered on that this morning in duty free by buying her some perfume. And as you can see here, things are far from normal. Gone are the days that you simply pick up a sample, have a spray, and then a smell. However, the incredibly friendly staff in duty free were there to help. And this is something I'd like to say now, because I've travelled through Gatwick Airport hundreds of times in my life, and I've always found the staff incredibly friendly. The security staff, I must admit, are some of the funniest I've ever come across. And despite the serious nature of their work, humour doesn't go amiss. So thank you, Gatwick. Well done to Gatwick for their fantastic friendly staff. But as we enter Boots, airside at Gatwick's North Terminal, you're probably asking the question, guys, why is Fiona buying sandwiches? As you know, Fiona and I are travelling in the British Airways Club World cabin, their business class cabin, and yes folks, you would expect decent food. But again, this is a casualty to Lady Corona, and we'd read on many Facebook posts how bad the food was, and the recommendation was to pick up some sandwiches before boarding. So 4 meal deals later at Boots, Fiona and I were en route to the British Airways Lounge. Well, no, it wasn't really the British Airways Lounge, because again, another casualty of British Airways moving to the South Terminal is we were heading to the Aspire Lounge, and that is certainly not the British Airways Lounge that we would have expected at the South Terminal. Coronavirus rules meant checking in at the Aspire Lounge took a little bit longer than normal. If Fiona and I had downloaded the NHS track and trace app, things would have been a lot faster, or certainly the process would have taken a lot less time. As residents in Scotland, Fiona and I had downloaded the Scottish NHS track and trace app. I know, guys, the UK is a small country, but things are slightly complex with the devolved authorities. But a word to the wise, it's probably a sensible thing to do before you make this journey if you make sure you download the NHS track and trace app for England. Like most airport lounges the world over during the coronavirus pandemic, the Aspire Lounge here in Gatwick's North Terminal was doing table service only. However, one of Fiona's little traditions when entering the lounge is to order a glass of champagne, because that gets her holiday off to an excellent start. However, that wasn't to be at the Aspire Lounge, because they wanted paid for champagne, clearly something we weren't used to, normally travelling through the British Airways Terrace Lounge at the South Terminal. If memory serves me right, I had a cappuccino, Fiona had a fruit plate, and soon our flight was being called, so it was off to the gate. Through an extremely quiet terminal, something, guys, I will probably never get used to, and I hope this pandemic is over soon and things get back to normal. And hand sanitizer stations are something else that you will see throughout Gatwick's North Terminal during these strange times, along with perspex screens separating passengers from staff. We didn't have long to wait in this holding lounge before boarding was called. And this was the pretty usual process of boarding class by class. So first, this being a 3-class aircraft, business, premium economy and economy, the Club World cabin was called first. So Fiona and I were on the way to our aircraft, a British Airways 777-200ER. And of course, the fantastic British Airways ground staff here at Gatwick were on hand to police the boarding process, making sure that only those with the correct boarding passes boarded first. Fiona and I were sitting in seats 4A and 4B, so unusual for us, we were finally turning left through the door. Something for us that happens very rarely on board British Airways. And this is where we encountered the next casualty of Lady Corona. One of the lovely things about travelling in the BA Club World cabin is normally the pre-departure beverage, which for us is always a glass of champagne. But sadly, the coronavirus has put a stop to that. And sadly, this would not be the only cutback on board British Airways in the Club World cabin, which I will talk you through during this trip report. Anyway, back to seats 4A and 4B. I've always said this on my trip reports when we're travelling in the Club World cabin. I quite like the seat configuration, despite the product being nearly 2 decades old. I think British Airways was the first airline in the world to deliver lie-flat beds in business class. And while this hard product has been overtaken by the new BA Club World Suites, in response to competition, I have to admit I still like this 20-year-old product. So I got as comfortable as I could wearing a mask and using the sanitizer pads. I gave the table a wipe down at my seat before the aircraft started to push back, heading towards runway 26 left here at London Gatwick Airport. And just as I commented in my last trip report on board the EasyJet A319 from Glasgow down to London Gatwick yesterday, my mood took a downward turn, seeing all of these aircraft parked up, sitting, not doing anything, and certainly not flying. And with Gatwick's South Terminal here closed, all of the aircraft you're seeing parked up at gates are parked up, grounded due to the coronavirus pandemic. For a self-confessed avgeek like me, this is an extremely sad sight. And another reality of the coronavirus pandemic, we actually taxied onto the runway without any holding. Gatwick Airport is the world's busiest single runway airport in the world. And in normal times, waiting to enter the runway is the norm, and certainly not the exception, like this morning. Checking out flight radar 24, we departed westbound this morning on Gatwick's 26 left, initially heading towards Southampton before Land's End, and then making our transatlantic crossing towards the Eastern Caribbean and St Lucia, where as expected we'd approach from the north of the island, turning southbound and then finally eastbound towards runway 10, which I guess would be a visual approach due to the lack of ILS at Hewanorra International Airport. And shortly after takeoff, we were handed even more paperwork, this time from the St Lucian government, asking us some questions, paperwork we would have to produce on arrival at St Lucia, which would add to the already mountain of paperwork we'd printed off ahead of this trip. Yes guys, flying to many global destinations during the coronavirus pandemic requires killing a rainforest or two. One of the things that Lady Corona hasn't killed during the coronavirus pandemic is, of course, the business class Amenity kit, and from British Airways, this is from White & Co. To be honest, you get the usual stuff in it, like an eye mask, toothpaste, socks, potions and lotions, etc. Stuff, to be honest, that went in the bin when I got to St Lucia. However, the little zip leather bag is a perfect size for all of the cables and bits and pieces that I carry along with my camera equipment on these sorts of trips. So after dumping the contents in the bin in St Lucia, my White & Co bag, courtesy of British Airways, is home to my camera cables. And finally, after checking out her own Amenity kit, Fiona finally got her first glass of champagne of the day. And this brings me to the next update for the British Airways service. During the coronavirus pandemic, the airline are simply serving miniatures in plastic glasses, just like you would find back in economy. Yeah, gone are the days of those cut crystal glasses. And straight after the drink service came the meal service. Yeah, this cold boxed meal service. And while we were expecting this reduced service in the club cabin, I'm glad that Fiona and I had chosen to buy those meal deals in Boots back in Gatwick's North Terminal. So, as you can see, our lunchbox has arrived and Fiona's going to tell you what's in hers.
So we have salmon, I think it's probably a Bellini, because you can see the wee pancakes underneath. So salmon with cream cheese and Bellini pancake. Turkey and cheese sub, British Airways branded, of course. A little bit of tart for those of us that like a little lemon. Some cheese and olive oil and sea salt crackers for our cheese. 2 cheeses, 2 crackers. Should probably be 1 chunk of cracker, 1 chunk of cheese. bottle of water still. And just in case, I've ordered some red wine.
Being allergic to fish, there was no way I was eating the salmon, but actually the turkey sub wasn't bad. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't quite the chicken curry which I would normally get as the signature dish on board British Airways in the Club World cabin, but I guess these times aren't normal. The one thing that I would like to say is a flight on board British Airways is either made or ruined by the quality of the cabin crew, and on our flight today, the flight was absolutely made by the fantastic cabin crew that were a credit to British Airways. Before any of you flying on British Airways get grumpy about the reduced service, please think about these fantastic men and women. Thousands have lost their jobs so far as a result of the coronavirus pandemic, and those who are left and working have accepted pay cuts and reduced contracts, sometimes by a bullish airline with questionable HR practices. So as our flight descends towards St Lucia, any BA cabin crew happen to be watching this video, Fiona's and my heart goes out to you all. You are the beating heart of an airline that has reduced service over the decades, and I know you face the brunt of passengers' frustrations. But as we descend into a cloudy and stormy afternoon over northern St Lucia, we can clearly see Pigeon Island and the causeway, which is the home to the Sandals Grand St Lucian, where Fiona and I would be spending the next 11 nights. Looking back at this flight and the last 8 hours and 40 minutes wearing a mask, I thought it was going to be a lot worse than it actually was. You know, it's not nice having to wear face covering for the entire flight, but if this is the small price we have to pay to get away from the UK at the moment, while making the lives of the cabin crew and our fellow passengers a safer one, I guess it is a small price to pay. And as we were about to turn final onto runway 10 at St Lucia's Hewanorra International Airport, the pitons, the national symbols of this beautiful island, come into view. And you will of course see a lot more of the pitons if you watch our holiday diary videos, which will be coming up very soon. Until then, it is time to sit back in seat 4A and watch the view outside the window as we make our final approach. It was about 1:30 in the afternoon when we landed at St Lucia, and of course that meant today a thunderstorm. Guys, we are in the tropics, so that has to be expected. And as we pulled on to stand, we got the first view of the tents, where the St Lucian Health Authority would be checking our COVID status and allowing us entry into the country as long as we complied. As the aircraft came to a stop, the cabin crew announced that everyone had to remain in their seats until an official from the St Lucian Health Authority boarded the aircraft and gave us permission to leave, which would be done by row number to ensure social distancing was maintained. And for us, the good news was that the Club World cabin was the first to be released, and being seated in 4A and 4B meant that Fiona and I would be first off the aircraft and first into the COVID tents. And as we made our way across the rainy tarmac, we were being directed towards the covered walkway, a walkway that Fiona and I had walked through many times on our various visits to St Lucia, but this time we would be directed into the COVID tents, where we would be met by scary looking ladies covered from head to toe in PPE. And this was the first check of 2 in the COVID tent, where our temperatures were taken and our documents were checked, making sure that we had complied with all of the rules and regulations that we had researched before making this journey. And this is something to point out. It is absolutely your responsibility if you're travelling abroad to make sure that you and your family comply with the rules and regulations that have been put in place by the government of the country you're going to visit. In our case, the British Airways check-in agent was very diligent in making sure that we had complied, and if we hadn't, I doubt we would have even made it onto the aircraft in London Gatwick. As you can see, the COVID tent here at St Lucia was extremely quiet, and in fact we were the only passenger aircraft that was landing at St Lucia's Hewanorra airport that day, and with Fiona and I being pretty well first off the aircraft, we were going to get through this process very quickly, or so we hoped. Our friends Donna and Michael arrived 4 days later on the Saturday, and their British Airways 777 had landed just behind the American Airlines flight from Miami and the JetBlue service from New York, meaning that their wait here in the COVID tent lasted nearly 2 hours, which was in complete contrast to the less than 30 minutes that it took Fiona and I to step off the aircraft and step on the bus to the Grand St Lucian. And here we are approaching the second checkpoint, where our documentation would be scrutinised in a lot more detail, and coloured armbands would be placed around our wrists showing the airport authorities that we had been approved to land in St Lucia. These armbands were only for the arrival process, and Fiona and I removed them later in the Sandals club lounge at the Grand St Lucian. So approved to remain in St Lucia, Fiona and I made our way from the COVID tent and along the apron beside the terminal to the customs check and the immigration hall, which is a normal process that you go through during normal times, but of course it is not normal in 2020. And arriving in the baggage hall less than 15 minutes after stepping off the aircraft, it is time to bring this trip report from London Gatwick to St Lucia during October 2020 and the coronavirus pandemic to an end. As we make our way to the dedicated Sandals lounge at this airport, I just want to say thank you for watching. And if you want to continue following Fiona and I on our Sandals vacation during October 2020 at the Sandals Grand St Lucian, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. And on my next video, I will take you on the commute, the transfer between the airport and the hotel, which takes between 90 minutes and 2 hours. One final note, guys, as we enter the Sandals lounge at St Lucian Airport. While this trip was a complete pain in the ass to organise, as you will see if you watch the videos to follow, it was absolutely worth it, and I'm going to leave you with that. Thanks again for watching.